Welcome back, everyone, to the deep dive. You know how we do things here. We love to, dig into the details, get to the bottom of complex issues, make sure you don't have to, right? Today, we're looking at something pretty interesting. It's a study called Urban-Rural Cooperation for a 100% renewable energy economy and climate protection towards 2030. The region, Berlin-Brandenburg. That's a mouthful. But essentially, the question is, can a big city like Berlin and the area around it, Brandenburg, can they actually power themselves completely with just renewable energy? And by 2030, it's not that far away.
Yeah, and what's really neat about this study is it's not just, some pie in the sky idea. They actually used a model, a linear cost minimization model, which
Yeah.
basically means they're looking for the absolute cheapest way to get to that 100% renewable goal. They take into account all sorts of factors like how much sun and wind you can realistically get, what the technology can actually do, all that practical stuff.
So we're not just talking about if it's possible, but if it's possible in the most efficient, affordable way, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
That's what makes this study so valuable. They're not just saying, hey, it's technically possible. They're saying, hey, this is how we could actually do it, and here's how much it might cost.
Okay, so let's dive in, shall we? I think one of the things that jumps out right away from this study is this emphasis on 2030. Why is that date so crucial for them?
Well, they tie it very closely to the Paris Agreement, that global agreement to try and limit global warming. They argue that if we really want to keep warming well below 2 degrees Celsius, ideally at 1.5 degrees, we basically have to be at net zero greenhouse gas emissions by around 2030. And they're pretty blunt about it. Later targets, like 2045 or 2050, those might actually lead to more investment in fossil fuels, which would obviously be counterproductive in the long run.
So it's like they're saying we don't have the luxury of aiming for those later dates if we're serious about the Paris Agreement goals.
Right. It's about
Yeah.
urgency. Yeah, I know. They also make a point about the speed of deployment. They look at various low-carbon technologies like nuclear power, carbon capture, and they conclude that based on historical data, none of those can really be scaled up fast enough to make a significant impact within this decade. Fossil gas also doesn't look great in their analysis because of the methane emissions and, in Germany's case, the reliance on imports, which raises energy security issues.
Makes sense. So the study really zeroes in on renewables as the only viable option if we're talking about that 2030 timeframe.
Exactly. And they're not just looking at renewables in general, they're focusing specifically on the Berlin-Brandenburg region.
Right. So why Berlin-Brandenburg? Why this particular region?
It serves as a really concrete case study. They're trying to develop a plan that directly aligns with Germany's overall climate commitments. By focusing on a specific area with its own unique features and challenges, they can get really detailed about how this transition could actually happen in practice.
Okay, so let's talk about the starting point. What was the energy situation in Berlin-Brandenburg like when they did this study?
So the most recent data they had at the time was from 2017, and it showed a pretty heavy reliance on fossil fuels, mainly gas and oil. Renewables were there, but only a small part of the mix. There was also a chunk of energy coming from combined heat and power plants, but the fuel source for those wasn't specified. The study estimates that by 2020, the share of renewables had gone up to about 16.4%. Still, that's a huge jump to get to 100% in just 10 years.
A massive transformation, for sure. So what does this 100% renewable scenario actually look like in the study? Paint us a picture.
Well, they model a complete switch to renewables across all sectors: electricity, heating, even transportation. And what's really striking is they find this is not only technically possible, but it could actually be cheaper in the long run than sticking with our current system based on fossil fuels and nuclear.
Cheaper in the long run? That's a big claim. How do they get to that conclusion?
One of the key ideas is sector coupling. It's basically about integrating different energy sectors instead of treating them separately. Like if you have excess solar power during the day, you can use that to power heat pumps for heating or charge electric vehicles instead of just letting it go to waste. It's about smart management of energy flows across different sectors.
So it's not just about producing renewable energy, it's about using it intelligently across different parts of our lives.
Precisely. That's a big part of how they make the economics work in this study.
All right, so let's get into the nuts and bolts. What are the key technologies they're betting on for this 100% renewable system? How many solar panels and wind turbines are we talking about here?
Solar photovoltaics, or PV, plays a huge role in their scenario. They see a ton of potential for installing PV, especially on rooftops in both Berlin and Brandenburg. They're talking about a really ambitious expansion, both in terms of rooftop solar in the cities and larger ground-mounted solar farms in the countryside.
Brandenburg already has a good amount of wind power, right? Does wind still play a big part in this vision?
Absolutely. Onshore wind in Brandenburg remains a key part of the mix. The study expects to see significant growth in wind capacity there as well.
Now, I'm curious about those times when the sun isn't shining and the wind isn't blowing. How do they deal with those gaps in renewable generation? How do they keep the lights on, so to speak?
That's where green hydrogen comes in. They see it as essential for ensuring a reliable energy supply, especially during those times when solar and wind output is low. And to produce that hydrogen, they're talking about needing a lot of electrolyzer capacity.
Electrolyzers, right. Those are the devices that use electricity to split water into hydrogen and oxygen, creating a clean fuel.
Exactly. And that green hydrogen can then be stored and used to generate electricity when needed, maybe through fuel cells, maybe even in modified gas turbines that can run on hydrogen. What's interesting is that they see most of this hydrogen storage happening in Brandenburg, not in Berlin. It makes sense since there's more space for larger storage facilities there.
So Brandenburg becomes like this giant green energy battery, providing backup power to Berlin.
Kind of, yeah. Although they also emphasize the role of battery storage for dealing with shorter-term fluctuations in supply and demand. They say we'll need a good amount of battery capacity to smooth out those more immediate peaks and troughs in renewable energy generation.
What about heating? We can't exactly heat our homes directly with sunshine, can we?
No, of course not.
Yeah.
They propose a big shift towards heat pumps and direct electric heating, basically electrifying a lot of the heating sector. That way we're using renewable electricity for heating instead of fossil fuels.
Lots of infrastructure changes then. I imagine the existing power lines between Berlin and Brandenburg will need an upgrade too, right?
Yeah, the study assumes that the power lines will need to be expanded to handle this increased flow of renewable electricity from Brandenburg to Berlin. And they also talk about needing new hydrogen pipelines to transport that green hydrogen.
Makes sense. Are there any other renewable sources in the mix? What about things like biomass or geothermal?
They do consider those, but on a smaller scale. Bioenergy, both solid and gaseous, could play a part, mainly in combined heat and power plants. And they factor in a bit of geothermal energy as well. But the real workhorses in their scenario are solar, wind, and green hydrogen.
So it's really about that urban-rural cooperation that we talked about at the beginning. Berlin relying on Brandenburg for a lot of its clean energy. How exactly do they envision that working in practice?
It's really a symbiotic relationship. They show very clearly that Brandenburg's excess renewable energy, especially from wind and those big solar farms, is absolutely crucial for meeting Berlin's energy needs. They estimate that about half of Berlin's electricity could come from Brandenburg in this scenario.
So Berlin essentially becomes dependent on its surrounding countryside for its green power.
Pretty much, yeah. And to make that work, those expanded power lines and hydrogen pipelines are really important. That's how they get the energy from where it's produced to where it's needed.
Now let's talk about cost. We touched on it earlier, but I'm curious about the specifics. What kind of price tag are we looking at here?
They estimate an average energy cost of about 76 euros per megawatt hour in their main scenario. What's interesting is that they compare that to the national average energy costs at the time, and it's actually quite competitive. Even compared to fossil fuels, it doesn't look bad at all.
So going green doesn't necessarily mean paying more, at least according to the study.
Right. Of course, there's the initial investment to consider. They estimate about 112 billion euros needed by 2030 to make all this happen. That's obviously a significant amount of money. But they also look at how different cost assumptions for things like hydrogen storage and transport would affect the overall economics. They model scenarios with more conservative and more optimistic cost estimates.
And what do those different scenarios show? Does the viability of this whole plan hinge on some big technological breakthroughs that drastically reduce costs?
It's interesting, they find that even with more conservative cost assumptions for hydrogen, the 100% renewable scenario still works out financially, although it's more expensive overall. And if those costs come down faster, as they project in their more optimistic scenario, the total cost could be even lower. So continued innovation in those areas is definitely important, but it's not a make or break factor.
All of this sounds really promising, but are there any challenges or limitations that they highlight? I mean, we're talking about a pretty radical transformation in a relatively short amount of time.
Oh, absolutely. They acknowledge the sheer scale and speed of the changes that are needed. They point out that you'd need some pretty big changes in regulations and economic policies to make this happen. And they also admit that their model has some simplifications. For example, They don't fully account for the potential for increased flexibility that could come from connecting to the larger European electricity grid. They're mostly focusing on regional self-sufficiency.
Right, so they're looking at Berlin-Brandenburg as a relatively independent system. What about things like electric vehicles that can feed power back into the grid?
That's another area where they simplify things a bit. They mention the potential for electric vehicles to help stabilize the grid with bidirectional charging, but it's not fully integrated into their main model. Same goes for other emerging energy storage technologies. They acknowledge those could play a bigger role in the future than they're currently showing.
And what about heat storage? We talked about that earlier. Any limitations in how they model that aspect?
Yeah, they admit their representation of heat storage is simplified. A more detailed analysis could provide more insights. They also assume a certain level of inflexibility in industrial energy demand, which might not be totally accurate.
And when it comes to bioenergy, are they confident about the long-term sustainability of those resources?
They use current estimates for sustainable bioenergy potential, but they emphasize that more research is needed to be absolutely sure. And they also mention the importance of minimizing any leakage of hydrogen, since that can have a climate impact as well.
So it's a positive outlook overall, but with some caveats and areas for further investigation.
Exactly. It's a solid framework, but real-world implementation is always more complex.
All right, let's wrap things up. We've done a deep dive into this study, urban-rural cooperation for a 100% renewable energy economy and climate protection towards 2030, the region Berlin-Brandenburg. What's the key takeaway for our listeners?
The main message is that it's entirely possible for a large region like Berlin-Brandenburg to completely transition to renewable energy by 2030, and to do it in a way that makes economic sense. It requires a close partnership between urban and rural areas, relying heavily on solar, wind, and green hydrogen.
A hopeful message for sure. So here's something for everyone listening to think about. What opportunities and challenges would there be for similar collaborations in your own region? What kind of renewable resources do you have? What about the existing infrastructure and policies? Food for thought as we all work towards a cleaner energy future. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.